T4 ne ahwefo me mo bibia kwa baba daily update so ene ne di kan ena wa be pim away channel no so hi daily updates eba ne news papa they are trending news, breaking news, current affairs for any term a daily update now sa bekabi news enya common cra news enya release into the system sa news no oba on sabeke boy daily update TV so and you also borema no subscribe no about notification bell so wa no brave on sabeka a video no bi ahwe borem so a obaba beta aka video no bi so ahwe na yekoti eye omampanyi former president his excellency and bi okopi mo Ohio University na ensembe no kano wa yebakwa kuti speech no the means momre no yekoti omampanyi speech ensembe no kan Yemura Sanse and Kuti Mampanyi. I daily update TV. So, your source will be sharing or liking our friends in your bomb. I say, a T4 near Sheffield. We love you. We give you the best. 24th November. A year presidential, a year MPP presidential election. A backup and live to the better from your report on me. T4 said it in Tina. Your source will subscribe or not subscribe. So, don't say, Becca, a news should be a brain baby. The better. I'm sure. Stay tuned. Share my God bless you.
I know that it is one of the reasons I stand here today as a firm believer in democracy and the rule of law. Dr. Akroma was Ghana's first president. My father worked in his administration as a minister of state. Arising from the coup, he was removed from office and he was thrown in jail. That Easter vacation with my father in jail and my mother living in the northern part of the country, and without transportation, nobody came to collect me from boarding school. All my fellow pupils were picked up by their family members, everyone except me. The headmistress attempted to deliver me to my father. When we got to our home in the Kanda Estates part of Accra, the home I knew was my father's, was occupied by military officers. The headmistress asked about my father, and the military man replied her gruffly in a hoarse voice, "Mr. Mahama does not live here anymore." That coup d'etat arrested the development not only of our country's infrastructure, but also the growth of our economy. It arrested the development of families, educations, careers, and the dreams of so many Ghanaians. It is a fact now that many of these coups d'etats were instigated by former colonial powers and their allies, whose vision of the future of these African nations differed from those of our leaders. Others, of course, were born out of the frustration of citizens triggered by the corruption and high-handedness of some early post-independence administrations, while others were driven just by the raw ambition of young military officers who wished to short-circuit their way into leadership. Either way, the people were stripped of their choice to elect their leaders and their lawmakers. A question I'm often asked is whether all dictators, by definition, are bad. It is true that throughout history, some dictators have dramatically improved the conditions of their countries. Some dictators are well educated and are not interested in enriching themselves at the expense of their nations. They genuinely love their countries and want to see their countries at their best. In Ghana, reforms carried out under the military administration of the Provisional National Defense Council, the PNDC, through what was called the Economic Recovery Program, returned Ghana's economy onto a path of positive gross domestic product growth, GDP growth, after many years of recession. Unfortunately, no one gets to choose his dictator or his autocrat in the business of unconstitutional government systems. Nobody gets the choice to root out the murderers and psychopaths or the thieves and looters amongst dictators. Except that if there was such a choice, then it will no longer be a dictatorship, but a democracy. Ultimately, that makes dictatorships unacceptable because they give the population no choice and are not accountable to anybody. And if they do not voluntarily cede power, they can only be eliminated by another coup d'etat. It is a vicious cycle that goes round and round. Thankfully for the African continent, in most countries, that cycle eventually ended. By the end of the Cold War, with the fall of the Berlin Curtain, the Berlin Wall, most African nations have started moving confidently back towards democracy. The citizens had grown tired of the revolving door of military dictators, each with their delusions of grandeur. The world was changing after the Cold War. It was becoming what we call a global village. Air travel was more accessible and more affordable. More countries across the globe were now trading with each other. Countries with dictators were generally treated as pariahs. This meant they could not be welcomed in some world capitals. But Africa needed to be a part of this, so it became trendy, almost fashionable in Africa, for African countries to be returned to constitutional democracy. With constitutional rule came elections, and it brought with it set terms of office, that is, limits on how many terms leaders could run. It brought with it free speech, accountability, and oversight and respect for human rights. African nations took quickly to democracy. On the political front, we saw extremely high turnout for elections, generally above 80%, between 80 and 90%. These were numbers Western countries that had been touting democracy for decades could only dream of. Citizens, regular people who had long been disenfranchised, were eager to have their votes counted and their voices heard. Technology enabled countries to leapfrog into the modern day. It provided access to utilities and services that for the majority had previously been beyond their reach. Cellular phones did away with waiting time to be installed. This was especially useful for citizens who lived in villages and remote areas. The new media brought the world straight to everybody's handset and transported to the world an Africa that Western televisions seldom show. Africa led with the fastest increase in broadband connectivity in the world. This was an Africa that was glorious, fascinating, and full of possibilities. The continent started to experience a renaissance in film, in arts, literature, music, and sports. There was an increase in tourism, which in turn gave rise to a growth of the hospitality services sector. With these crucial changes, several African nations found themselves on the list of the fastest growing economies in the world. Another crucial development was that citizens who had fled their countries during the difficult years and during the periods of military dictatorship effectively began to return home, creating what we call a brain gain instead of a brain drain. In many ways, it seemed like such a breathtaking comeback for Africa. But beneath the surface of that success, most African nations were still grappling with institutionalized corruption. Though the people were indeed electing leaders and lawmakers, there has often been an attempt to change the constitution in some countries to enable leaders prolong their tenure in office. There's been a constant tug of war between the elite who want to continue to hold on to power and privilege and the rest of the population who refuse to be neglected any longer. The citizens want a fair share in the success of their countries. They want that success reflected in affordable housing, decent jobs that pay a living wage, and lower food and petrol prices. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. The cost of living in much of Africa has gotten higher and higher. One of Africa's biggest challenges is its fast-growing youth population. It's estimated that 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 35. Many of these people have very few prospects for employment or housing. They are frustrated, disillusioned, and angry, making them ideal recruits for involvement in insurgencies or terrorism. The larger these insurgent groups become, the more difficult it is to stop them from waging violent attacks, seizing towns or regions, and becoming de facto governments in those places, often implementing their own ideological laws and dress codes. Meanwhile, Africa has also been figuring out how to deal with an expanding crisis, reflected in recurrent floods and droughts. Weather patterns are changing so quickly and drastically that they are virtually impossible to predict nowadays. Crops are being affected, people are being displaced, creating a new group of climate refugees. You are right if this sounds like the perfect storm or a powder keg about to explode. And that's precisely what you've been seeing happening in West Africa throughout this and the past years. There have been predictions that suggest that there will be many more coups on the continent going forward. These predictions may prove accurate. Even so, I don't believe that despots will overrun the whole continent. I'm optimistic that the citizens will fight hard to return their countries back to democratic rule sooner rather than later. But I don't say it as a politician or as a historian. I say it as a human being who has lived through periods of military dictatorships. During my late teenage years and young adulthood, the nation's finances were so tattered that government had to implement a scheme for rationing. We rationed everything from cloth to beer. We had curfews. There was a lack of respect for human rights and free speech. Food was rationed and petrol was rationed. It is an unsustainable reality, but as I mentioned earlier, for Ghana, the silver lining was in the dark cloud, which was the major reforms that were carried out by the PNDC under the Economic Recovery Program that restored Ghana's economy to a path of growth under military rule. Normally, people living in dictatorships will get tired of being bullied and having their freedom dangled in front of them like a carrot. They will either leave that country or they will revolt, but they will never submit to that treatment forever. Countries like Ghana that are committed to democracy must continue serving as examples and inspiring others to do the same. We must continue to permit free speech, even if it is critical of government. We must allow the media to operate freely and without intimidation. We must continue the peaceful transfer of power, no matter how hard fought any election was, or if one of the parties decide to challenge the results in court. We must rely on our institutions to do precisely what they were designed for. At the start of this lecture, I pointed out that context is important anytime we speak of Africa. Ghana, the first sub-Saharan country to gain independence, is just 1 year older than me. Just 1 year, that's all. We can't even let ourselves forget that we're speaking of relatively new countries, ones that were formed with arbitrary borders by our colonizers, boundaries sometimes that divide tribal groups into half. Every nation goes through growing pains, and African countries are no different. We're still figuring out how best to belong to ourselves, given how young African countries are and how well we have managed to keep stepping forward. Even when we have found ourselves on shaky ground, I'm sure we will be just fine. The path to a consolidated democratic order has been far from smooth. The recent events in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Guinea, and recently Gabon serve as a stark reminder that challenges persist, threatening the very foundations of democratic progress. And I must say that in some of these countries, the insurrections or the coup d'etats that took place are the result of insecurity in the Sahelian region. As a result of the collapse of Gaddafi's government in Libya, there was an outpouring of small arms into the Saharan region, and the Sahelian region, and that is being used by insurgents to destabilize these countries. Apart from that, several of these countries are French-speaking, and some of the reasons assigned for these overthrow of governments is vestiges of their colonial heritage from their colonizers, France. Coups as seen in these countries present a significant stumbling block to the consolidation of democracy in West Africa, replacing the voice and will of the people with the barrel of a gun. To avoid such disturbances, countries must recognize and address the root causes, which can be traced back to weak democratic institutions, insufficient checks and balances, and a general lack of respect for the rule of law. We must promote inclusive governance as a fundamental pillar of democratic progress. Citizens must be able to participate in the decision-making process, regardless of their ethnicity, their gender, political affiliation, or socio-economic background. If we embrace inclusivity, African countries can bridge societal divisions and minimize grievances. Supporting and protecting the work of civil society is crucial in safeguarding the gains made by African democracies. Independent media, trade unions, and advocacy organizations are vital in holding governments accountable and acting as guardians of democratic principles. Lastly, we must invest in the education and empowerment of our young people. They are the torchbearers of democracy, the stakeholders who will shape the future of our countries and our continent. And so let us equip them with the knowledge, skills, and confidence to engage in the democratic process. And we will, by so doing, be empowering them to become active citizens and not spectators, who would lead Africa towards a brighter, more democratic future. As I conclude, I want to encourage every one of you to join the global effort to strengthen democracy in Africa and around the world. The successes and challenges of post-Cold War African democracy depends not only on African leaders, but also on the solidarity and support that is shown to Africa by the international community. Let us fight against the forces threatening our democratic values and work tirelessly to build strong, inclusive, and accountable democracies. Only then can we ensure that the successes of African democracy will prevail over the challenges the continent faces. The only guarantee for constitutional rule is selfless and visionary leadership, the respect for rule of law, and the respect for and protection of our human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay. All right. So it's because they want a job and be able to earn a salary. And so their heart is really not in policing. And so recruitment is one of the major problems. Aside from that, we must give opportunity for all Ghanaians to be a part of our police service. And so we had experimented with recruiting on a regional basis. And so going to every region and recruiting and bringing them together. We made the training for police officers 6 months. And so you had to go through the mandatory 6 months training. In recent times, I've heard them short-circuiting the training to a shorter period and moving the people into the service without adequate training. And that can be a part of the problem. But also, it's not just the police service, it's also us, the public. A police service is as good as the public that cooperates with it. And sometimes a crime happens, or criminals live amongst us in society. If you don't give the information to the police service, there's no way the police service can root those criminals out. And so it's a cat and horse situation. We need to cooperate with the police in order that they can adequately protect us. At the same time, we must train the police better, and we must also make sure that we recruit the appropriate quality of people to go into the service. And that's why there are qualifications for going into the service, and they include
I'm sure say wajibre na wati ene no so akosi be so say uti ene no mpacho all comment be so show doing contribution or suggesting ideas be e patro comment section with him do comment na show wajibre na community for so ati binti no me say momre kra no I daily update TV so any it's also be share no like enough for so enye bia hwe it's also 4th November so people for presidential primaries no ebe so live into daily update TV so ebe cover na live into no na so do any so actual daily update now so abeka a video ni be so na hwe into the so subscribe and not subscribe. Yɛda wase say only